Already in the context.
I took a photo of the frog with the background.
It's fun.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So today Galvin's gonna be talking about
How about this? How about mind your own fucking business?
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So today Galvin's gonna be talking about fall migration. Couple announcements first. River walk tomorrow, same time, same place, 5:30 at St. John's. Our next trip will be October 2nd. We're doing a private marsh tour with the Appalachia Ohio Alliance. So they said it could be wet, bring like muck boots, but it's cool, the private marsh, and we're gonna help them survey and see what's on the property. Not much else going on. Hope you guys are doing all right with midterms. I know it's busy right now. But yeah, Galvin, you wanna go start?
Sure can. All right, so yeah, we're going to be talking about fall migration today, which I know we've been discussing a lot on our river walks and field trips because we're kind of in the middle of it, getting towards the peak. We're going to kind of go over generally how it works, and then we'll cover some of the different groups we might be likely to see and how and where and what you'd expect to see out of those groups. So I think, nice. All right, so what is migration? As you know, birds migrate in both spring and fall. In the spring, they generally go north. In the fall, they generally go south. And that's an evolved strategy to maximize reproductive success. Because they migrate, they basically follow their resources so they can increase their survival and fitness over the years. All birds kind of migrate in different ways. Some of them have really impressive migrations that I'm sure you've heard a lot about. Other birds might just kind of go a few miles down the river or something like that. And not all birds migrate. Some, as you know, like the cardinals here on campus, most of them are fairly sedentary. They just stay in the same place all year round. This map here is a pretty famous map for a number of reasons. This is a map of a blackpoll warbler's fall migration route, and they do this really impressive. You can see the yellow up here is their breeding range, which is all throughout the boreal forests of Canada and Alaska, and even down into New England there. And then the purple there is their migration route. And this chunk of South America is their wintering grounds here. And what they basically do is they cut down across the Great Lakes to the East Coast, the Mid-Atlantic, and they remain there for at least a few days to a week, gathering energy reserves. And then they do a single nonstop flight all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to the tip of South America there. And we can cover a few more examples of impressive migrants with this handy little, handy little map. This is a map of the world. So you're all familiar with it. These are two of our other very famous migration routes. These are really impressive examples. These little arrows are both the routes that two shorebirds take. If we can imagine, this red arrow here is a red knot, which is a really very cute, fat shorebird looking thing. Lives on beaches and eats baby crabs. Pretty cool. They do something similar to the blackpoll warbler, where they breed all the way up here on the Arctic tundra, come down to the mid-Atlantic, and they gather in these huge masses and feed on horseshoe crab eggs. And they really are reliant on those horseshoe crab spawning events because they then fly all the way from there down. Some of them go all the way to the southern tip of Argentina down here. That's one of the longer distance migrations you'll see, but a lot of shorebirds in that same family share that migration route. And this yellowish, what color is that? I thought I made it yellow. This, whatever this is here, is another shorebird. This would be the Bartailed Godwit, and they are famous because they have the longest nonstop flight of any bird in the world. They go straight from Alaska here, where they breed up on the tundra again, all the way down to Australia, which is their wintering ground. So they do that in a single flight sometimes. Very impressive. Usually takes them about, 6-8 days. And this is kind of more standard. This is the route that most of our migrant birds through Ohio take. Kind of a shorter distance route, just crossing the Gulf of Mexico, which is still really impressive. They're doing that twice a year, but it's not, going to the other side of the world. This could be something like a common yellowthroat, which is a pretty common warbler we see here. We'll discuss those later. And then it keeps getting shorter. Oh. That red there could be something like a song sparrow, just going a few hundred miles south when the weather gets too cold for it and it needs to gain access to some more food resources. Those could be insects living in warmer temperatures or something like that. So there's really a range of distances and strategies covered, which is going to be important for some of the groups that we'll talk about later. All right, this is a more famous example. This is a bird that we don't often see in Ohio, only occasionally. This would be a northern wheat ear, and there's been a lot of research done on their migration because it's pretty impressive. So their scattered breeding range is actually similar to the shorebirds we talked about across the Arctic tundra, but they predominantly winter on the African continent over here. A lot of them winter in West Africa. So you might think it makes sense for them to come all the way down across Eurasia, down through the, that's actually like the north tip of the Red Sea there. And then they cross the Saharan Desert and make their way over, which some of them do, but some of them also go the other way and fly east, gathering on the tip of Iceland here, and then crossing the Atlantic again and making their way down through the Straits of Gibraltar to the same place that the same birds that they're on the breeding grounds with are, but they've gone around different sides of the world. Pretty cool thing. And then finally, just one more example here. This looks like the same migration route from two very closely related birds, and it is, but it also isn't. If we can imagine that the black arrow here is the arrow of a Pomeranian Jaeger, which is an Arctic breeding seabird, something we occasionally see in Ohio. It's going to be breeding up here on the tundra, again, with all those other Arctic shorebirds we talked about. And in the winter, they're actually pelagic species, which means that they live in the open ocean, and they can go all the way down here to off the southern tip of Argentina with our red knots. And it's going to have that migration taking place between August and November. Pretty long journey. Now, the white here, we're going to imagine is a South Polar skua. And South Polar skuas actually breed in Antarctica. And I've never been to Antarctica in June, but I don't think it's a pretty hospitable place. So the Antarctic summer is actually in what we consider to be winter, which would be, November through February. So that's when the weather is nicest, and that's when these birds that actually breed there, South Polar skua is definitely not the only one. That's when they breed. So although South Polar skua is a cohabitant species with Pomeranian Jaeger because they take the same migration route at the same time of year, while Pomeranian Jaeger is actually going to its wintering grounds to kind of just loaf around and fuel up for its journey back in the spring to get to its breeding grounds. South Polar skua is actually, that's what it considers its spring migration, to get to its breeding grounds and breed. And that's not by any means the only example. A lot of birds are austral migrants in that way, meaning if they breed here, they might actually go north at the same time as our northerly migrating regular migrants, but you get the idea. All right.
The Ornithology Club Antarctica trip coming.
It would come. I would love to see that happen.
It's probably
my wallet, and I think all of your wallets would not love to see it happen.
Bro, let's go.
All right. So when do birds migrate? We often think of birds migrating at night, which is how a lot of birds migrate. Those are mostly our passerines. But a lot of birds also, mainly our larger birds like raptors, like this osprey here, they migrate during the day because they need these, they're big birds. It takes a lot of energy for them to fly, so they have to maximize their energy, and they can use their soaring wings on thermal updrafts and currents and things like that, and go hundreds of miles without actually taking a single wing beat, which they definitely cannot do in the night when it's very cold. There's no updrafts for them to use. There's no warm air from the sun. Yeah, our passerines here that aren't really built for soaring like that will go through the night. Some are strictly nocturnal migrants. This here is a very pixelated white-throated sparrow that was detected with a thermal scope and spotlighted as it was actually migrating at about, I don't know, 11 p.m., 12 p.m. at night. 12 a.m. I guess. And then both. So that's a whimbrel on the right. It's another one of our Arctic breeding shorebirds, like we talked about the Bartailed Godwit earlier, that nonstop flight from Alaska to Australia. Obviously, they can't do that in a single night. So a lot of birds like this, and also some of our passerines, will also fly through the day and the night. And they'll do that for several consecutive days in a row. So it's kind of hard to predict some of these species, but a lot of birds, you can get a good idea whether they're going to be nocturnal or diurnal migrants. Yeah.
Is there a particular reason that our passerines mainly migrate at night? Is it like for foraging opportunities during the day or avoidance of predators?
That's a good question. I think there's a couple different theories. I know these guys in the back of the room probably know a bit more about it than I do, but
I think the
predator avoidance mostly, yeah.
Maybe star compass?
Yeah, so there's different theories about how they navigate, which different species actually may use different means of navigation. So yeah, navigation could also be a factor. It's a good question though. I might have to look more into that. All right, so now we can actually see all these birds. So these are kind of the different groups we're going to cover today. It's by no means like a complete summary of what there is to see in Ohio in fall migration, but we'll get a pretty good handle on the major groups you can learn to expect and what you're going to see out of them. So we'll go through warblers, thrushes, sparrows, shorebirds, ducks, and gulls. And you might have heard us say some of these words on trips or in meetings before and been a little confused. If we go through a slide and you're still confused, definitely ask questions. And we would like to clear that up, hopefully. All right, so we'll start with warblers. Warblers are really popular with birders because there are a lot of them and they can be really pretty. Ohio is one of the best places in the world to see our neotropical migrant wood warblers, as they're called. Just because we're in the flyway where the greatest diversity of them pass through, a lot of species that we take for granted here are actually really highly sought after by birders in other parts of the country. Like black-throated blue warblers up here, we see quite a few of in both spring and fall. Immediately west of us, they actually become a lot more uncommon, and it's basically only from here out to the east coast that they're really expected, and we do see really high numbers of them here. In fall, a lot of people are apprehensive about warblers because they molt into less colorful plumage, also for predator avoidance camouflage there. And there are also juveniles of many species. Oh yeah, I missed this before. In the fall, there are many more individual birds migrating back south than there are going north in the spring. Because if you think about it, birds breed up north every summer, hatch a bunch of baby birds. Those baby birds are also migrating back with the adults. So there's approximately double that number that are at least attempting that migration back south. So a lot of juveniles. So yeah, a lot of birds molt into less distinctive plumage. In the middle here, this is a Magnolia Warbler. This is what it looks like in the spring, very colorful. See this bold streaks of black down the yellow chest, this bold white eye line, black mask, very distinctive. You would know it if you saw it. That is unfortunately not what it looks like in the fall. This is a Magnolia Warbler in the fall, but you can see it still kind of retains some of those plumage characteristics. It's got the generally gray cap there, still retaining some black streaking on the chest, greenish gray overall, and most importantly, the tail pattern. If you were to see the undertail of this bird, the tail pattern is still the same. So although some things change, most of the relevant field marks remain. And if you kind of imagine all warblers generally as duller, more muted versions of their spring selves, you'll be all right. And the good news is, like this black-throated blue warbler up here, not all of them change. Black-throated blue warblers and many others, including our really colorful warblers, look exactly the same in the fall as they do in the spring, which is pretty nice. There are a lot more juveniles, which don't always look the same, but it's really nice to see like that splash of color once all the leaves start to fall off the trees and it starts to get really cold, which it's doing now. All right, thrushes. Yeah, this is not a thrush. We'll get to that. Thrushes are also long distance neotropical migrants for the most part. There's one species we'll talk about that's not such of a long distance migrant. They tend to stay on the ground. They're about, on average, twice the size of warblers. Warblers are about 4 inches long, if you can imagine that. And they come through in these really distinct waves. So time of year we're going to talk about can help with ID a lot because of the way these birds strategize their breeding and their molt, they migrate at different times of year. So on the right here is a Swainson's thrush. Swainson's thrush is probably our most common thrush in migration, and it has the broadest migration window. You can see it at just about any period in the fall when other thrushes are passing through. But in the middle here, this is a hermit thrush. Hermit thrushes are the short distance migrant I talked about earlier. A lot of them won't actually cross the Gulf of Mexico. They're just going down to the Gulf Coast states, Florida, Louisiana, and such. And as a result of that, they don't migrate quite as early as the other ones. Hermit thrushes are one of our latest migrants. They'll come through even through like mid-November when all the other thrushes are gone by mid to late October. Hermit thrushes are distinct. They have this reddish tail that contrasts with the body you can see. And hermit thrushes are later. There's also corresponding other species. So veeries tend to come through pretty early with wood thrushes. Gray-cheeked thrushes are a little later than that. You can kind of get this idea by checking past reports. At what time of year are you likely to see which thrushes? And from there, you can narrow down the identification because you can see they look a little similar there. And this is a gray catbird. I know we've seen a few on river walks and trips. They're a common bird. They breed in our area. They make really funny noises, but they're good cues to look for thrushes because they use similar habitat in the fall, and they eat similar things. They're big fans of native berries, pokeweed, and such. And so if you hear a catbird making cat noises somewhere, as they do, it's often a really good idea to check it out to see if there's any of these thrushes with it, because they do really heavily associate in migration. All right, thrushes. Next up, we have sparrows. I'm sure you're all familiar with sparrows. They're small and brown. Generally shorter distance migrants. That's not true for all of them, but most of them follow a similar migration route to our hermit thrush that we just talked about. And among birders, they're kind of thought of as notoriously confusing to ID, which can be true, especially if you don't get a great look. But I want to emphasize here that you should really be paying attention when you first see a sparrow to the face. And there are other marks involving streaking and structure and wing pattern and all of that. But the face is really the mark that I think will help you the most with every sparrow. Every sparrow has a different face. There's not really any that you need to look that have an identical facial pattern. So these are those same three birds that were up there, zoomed, enhanced, whatever you want. So it's a Lincoln sparrow on the left, song sparrow on the left, in the middle, and a Savannah sparrow on the right. And you can kind of see they're similar, right? I'm not saying they're vastly different, but if you take a closer look, you can really start to see some differences here. So if you look and see the song sparrow here, it has these really defined lines on the face. It has this really strong white mailer, which is kind of like the mustache strip. And the Lincoln sparrow here, which if you were to take away the head, would have a really similar looking body to the song sparrow. If you really zoom in on the face here, you see that the Lincoln sparrow is a lot more low contrast. So it still has these stripes here, but they're not really as thick and bold, which means that this mailer here isn't that bright white that it is on the song sparrow. So generally a lot warmer, buffier, smoother face is your key there. And Savannah sparrow here, you can see the obvious yellow in the lores, which is the area between the eye and the bill. And that's kind of a giveaway for Savannah sparrow. And even apart from that, you can see that the pattern is again a little finer than song sparrow. And it's got this really distinct white stripe on the crown, which is just the middle of the top of the head. So hopefully that will help you get a start on identifying sparrows. All right, and now shorebirds, which are another one of our, can be another one of our more confusing groups. Shorebirds generally refers to birds that like to live on beaches, on mud, in marshes, things like that. They're generally really long distance migrants. You noticed when we had that map at the beginning, a lot of the birds we talked about there were shorebirds going all the way from the Arctic tundra down to southern South America, or Australia in that case. And they have a really long migration window. So some species start coming through even in mid-July. July 15th is considered like the official start of shorebird migration. And they can move through basically the end of November and even into December in the case of some pelagic species. And they're really heavily affected by weather and water levels. So a lot of them will migrate both nocturnally and diurnally. They'll migrate at really high altitudes. And if a big weather system comes through, that weather system will literally knock those shorebirds out of the sky, and they'll kind of look for the best habitat right wherever they happen to be, which is a really good way to get out and look for them. And yeah, we'll take some time with the ID here because they can be a little tricky. So we'll start with the two main groups, Sandpipers and Clovers. This bird on the left here is a plover. It's a killdeer. You've all probably seen killdeers. They run around soccer fields and scream in parking lots for that bird. And these two on the right are Sandpipers. And the general differences here, if you look at the bill of a plover is very short and thick, and it has this big eye up here. And then the bill of a sandpiper on the right here is generally longer and thinner, and it looks less, I don't want to say less stupid, it kind of looks less stupid. But yeah. On the right here is a Bartailed Sandpiper. This is one of our pelagic sandpipers, they're called, and they're notoriously confusing, but if you can at least get a read on that, it's one of those peep sandpipers. You can then start to look for further field marks, which would help you narrow it down to the exact species. We're not gonna go over that today because it would take a long time. But this in the middle is another one of those really cool shorebirds. It's a red-necked phalarope. Phalaropes also breed on the Arctic tundra, but they spend their winters out in the middle of the ocean, floating hundreds of miles offshore, just bobbing around in the waves. They're really cool. They're about this big. And yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about phalaropes. I like them. They're cute. The Wilsons? Yeah, Wilsons are cool. Wilsons actually are like, they don't spend their winters on the ocean, unfortunately, but the other two do. Wilsons are still, they look similar, so they're also phalaropes.
Yeah, also Wilsons breed in the Great Lakes area.
They do, not on the tundra. All right. Almost through with this here. These are ducks. I put an exclamation point here because I really like ducks. Who doesn't like ducks? They're often facultative migrants here. And what that means is that unlike the other birds we talked about, which have to migrate every year to the same place, the same wintering grounds, the same breeding grounds, because they have such long distance migration routes, ducks have shorter migration routes and they're often forced to migrate. So they'll breed up on the marshes in the prairies, and some of them will even breed in the tundra, but they don't really need to go anywhere because all of their habitat and resource requirements are right there until the water basically gets cold enough to freeze. And the one thing ducks do require is water. So once water starts freezing, they'll force their way down to us. And that tends to happen at the same time every year, but it can vary a lot. And that is because of variation in temperature year to year. If water freezes really early, we'll see an early push of ducks. If water freezes late, we'll see a later push of ducks. And we can kind of divide ducks into these two groups, dabbling ducks and diving ducks. Dabbling ducks, like this mallard, I'm sure everybody's familiar with mallards. Dabbling ducks often live in marshes. They forage for food by dabbling. They just stick their head underwater and they take off little things off of vegetation and stuff like that. Diving ducks are more deep water ducks, like this long-tailed duck. They actually dive dozens of feet underwater and swim and catch fish and other such things that way. And it's a good distinction to note because you look at St. Marsh and Lake there, you can kind of tell where to look for those things. If you're going out to a marsh, you probably wouldn't expect to see a long-tailed duck, but you would expect to see mallards and teal and shovelers and things like that. But then if you go up to Lake Erie or out to one of the big reservoirs, Alum Lake, you'd expect to see long-tailed ducks. Things like this ringneck duck are going to be more common in your deep water habitats. Now, those aren't hard rules. You can definitely see things in diving ducks in marshes and dabbling ducks on lakes. But it kind of gives you a good idea of how to narrow down what you're looking at, because from a distance especially, ducks can be more confusing than you would think. And finally, we're going to talk about gulls. Gulls are great. I think they're often overlooked. A lot of people will just see them sitting on a beach and say, oh, look, there's gulls. But there are different kinds of gulls, and they often do have really cool migration routes. They're often overlooked, mostly because they are pretty hard to identify. They take several years to reach their full adult plumage, unlike most of the other birds we talked about. That basically means there's, for some species, 3 or 4 different plumages you have to learn instead of just the standard 1 or 2. But it's worth it to learn those plumages because gulls are very prone to wandering out of their normal range. And the big thing with birding is trying to find rare birds or birds that are someplace they're not supposed to be. Gulls are cool because you can kind of analyze wind and weather patterns and expect certain species to show up somewhere they're not supposed to be and go out looking for them. And when you find them, it's really satisfying. So this is kind of our basic parking lot gull here, ring-billed gull on the right. You've all definitely seen ring-billed gulls. On the left over here is something that looks kind of similar, but isn't quite. This is a Franklin's gull, which is a bird that breeds on the Great Plains and migrates also to South America. But they have this habit every 4 or 5 years of staging these eastward influxes. So with the right wind conditions, you can see almost like a fallout of Franklin's gulls on the Great Lakes or on the East Coast, which is a really cool event to look out for. And then this here is a little gull, which is kind of a cryptic species. They breed mostly in Europe, but there's a few hidden populations in Canada and the Great Lakes region. Nobody really knows where they breed. They kind of shift year to year. There's not a lot of them in North America though, so whenever you find one, it's always kind of a cool experience. All right, so those are gulls. And this is how you look for birds. First and foremost, you want to look at weather. So fall migration is really heavily influenced by winds and weather. This is a wind map here. This is actually from like 2 days ago. What you see here is really strong north winds coming down from the north. And here you have really strong south winds. And as you can imagine, birds that are going south in the fall are going to want winds at their back. So winds coming from the north are really conducive to bird migration. And the morning after a night of strong north winds, you're likely to see a lot of new migrants in your area. It'll be a really good thing to look for. And we can get a little more into that with general patterns of weather and what kinds of weather events influence which kinds of migration. But that's a really complex topic, and definitely ask me if you have questions about that. Time of year, we talked about already, because it influences timing of different species. Maybe some species migrate earlier or later than others because they're going to different wintering grounds, things like that. And then recent reports is a really good way, so you can actually see what other people have seen in your area. And if they've seen something that you would like to see, you can go see that bird. We talked about eBird last meeting. eBird is really helpful. This is like the alerts that Cassie went over and said you could sign up for. It'll basically say that, oh, look, you haven't seen a long-billed dowitcher in Ohio this year. You should go to Lucas County. Somebody reported one. You scroll down, you see the details. You'll see their comments, their photos. You can pull up a GPS pin to the location where they saw that bird, and then you can be on your way to go look for that bird. This is a Facebook group we'll talk about more on the next slide. Basically a site for seeing where people have reported birds that are rare to the state of Ohio. Actually, we can go there right now. All right, so if you don't have Facebook and you really enjoy birding and you'd like to see some rare birds, I would encourage you to join these 3 groups on Facebook: Ohio Shorebirds, Central Ohio Birders, and Birding Ohio. Ohio Shorebirds, like we talked about, is kind of a resource for rare birds in the state. It's a really information-focused group, but you're going to get really quick and accurate rare bird reporting from that group. Central Ohio Birders is less of a rare bird group, just a general photo sharing group, information sharing group, kind of focused to Columbus and the surrounding area. Also a really good group to join. And then Birding Ohio is the general state birding group. It's a really big group. There's often a lot of stuff to wade through, but occasionally some good information gets posted in there. This is a magnificent prairie bird. This bird was actually up by Cleveland yesterday, and thanks to the guy who found it getting the word out really quickly by way of some of these groups, a lot of people were able to go up and see it right before dusk because it was found pretty late in the day. And this is a really rare bird for the state of Ohio. We talked about eBird last slide. And then there's a Central Ohio Birders messaging group that's also for reports. Come talk to me if you'd like to join that. I think I have to message the admin to add you, but that's not a big deal. It is a good resource to be in. There's not a lot of clutter that goes on in there. It's maybe a message a day, if that. But it'll really get you quick and easy access to birds around Columbus because it's really heavily populated with Columbus-focused birds. And I think that's it. Yeah. If anybody has any questions, you can look at this Galactus skull while you ask said questions.
First cycle.
This is the first cycle, yes. Yes. The video of Falrops? Oh yeah, we sure can. Is Firefox the only web browser on this computer? We do. They just stay out way in the middle of the lake.
Okay.
And so those can actually migrate through December because they're really cold weather species. These. I want to see a spinny. Oh, this one's got to be a spinny, right? Do the spin. So Falrops have this distinctive characteristic of spinning around in the waves, which I'm really hoping this one's going to do.
Look at those little legs.
Yeah, they're like ducks, but shorebirds. They're kind of cool. I mean, there's got to be a spinning video somewhere. Maybe with rednecks.
The first one was.
Oh, yeah.
The first one.
But I want to see redneck spinning. Oh, no. Surely this one is a spinning video. Oh, yes. Oh, no, he's just munching. Oh, is he gonna spin?
Good.
Oh, come on. There has to
What
be
is that
somewhere.
one?
Which one?
The one that like where the water is really blue.
These birds don't spin.
I don't know what this is. Oh, it's on a nest. It's on a nest. That's what it's doing.
It just looks like it's that one and the non-breeding plumage.
Oh, here we go.
Play the Tokyo Drift music.
We'll edit it too. Look at it.
Dude, look at him go.
So they spin around and they stir up mud, and it brings up insects for them to eat.
They don't get
They
dizzy.
gotta get dizzy.
I guess not. I don't know.
They got bird brains growing in spine. Their brain is actually all to the left side of their head, so when they spin, even better.
All right, sweet.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nelson.
I know that was kind of short.
No, that was good.
Keep
Thank
people
you.
here forever.
Yeah. I'll stop the recording.